welcome to the Becoming an Ayn Rand Hero podcast. I'm your host, Mark Michael Lewis of theprofitabilitycoach.com and theentrpreneurleader.com and heroicmeaning.com. And we have today Dr. Stephen Hicks, a colleague, I'd like to think friend and mentor of mine, from whom I have learned a tremendous amount about Ayn Rand, both philosophically and in terms of how to apply Ayn Rand's ideas in my own life so that I can live a heroic life. And so, welcome, Stephen. It's nice to see you again.
Yeah, thanks again, Mark, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be back.
Great. So again, the focus of this podcast is not so much Ayn Rand's philosophy, but the application of it. Now, in order to apply it, you have to understand it, and so, of course, the philosophy is critically important, and we'll talk about that. But one of the things that has been great about watching your career is that your work on postmodernism, partially being picked up by Jordan Peterson and Move Forward, and partially just because of the focus of your work, you've been interviewed by a lot of different people about the impact of postmodernism versus modernism on our culture, especially as we move into what we might call woke culture. Yeah. What are the impacts of that? And I'm curious, what has it been like for you to be weighing in on these cultural conversations from a philosophical perspective?
Yeah.
Like, how do you understand your role? What's been your experience with that?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Some of the things are philosophical. Some things are a little more historical, because I do some of my philosophy in combination with intellectual history. So the question has not just been what are the philosophical ideas, their contenders, arguments back and forth, but precisely this question of application. When certain ideas have become prominent and people then apply them, they start off very abstract. What does that mean for the law, for politics, for art, for how people do religion, their family lives, and so on? So sometimes the historical lessons are also philosophically illuminating. And as well, it goes the other way. In many cases, the philosophers are responding to other philosophers, and they have kind of abstracted the arguments or the issues, and they're considering them in historical isolation. But in many cases, the philosophers are also trying to be empiricists in the sense of looking at what human beings are doing, what has happened in the economy, or why did we fight this war, or what was our response to that pandemic, and trying to draw broader lessons from that then inform a new version of the philosophy. So for me, to come back to our current culture wars that we're engaged with, I have seen a significant transformation in my cultural subsector, higher education. So from when I was a younger professor to now, I guess I'm an older professor.
More experienced professor.
Yes.
More years under your belt.
What's a nice euphemism to use there? But also following trends outside of the academic world, and clearly what has happened in the academic world has spilled over into lots of other cultural sectors, the arts, politics, journalism, family relations, and so forth. And so some of it has been disappointing in the sense that if you take the Postmodernism book, for example, I wrote that at the end of the 1990s, and the manuscript was done in the year 2000. I had some difficulties getting it published. It took 4 years of some rejections, and then it came out in 2004, so it's been 20 years ago. And it was interesting that when that book came out, I thought I was finished with postmodernism. So to speak. Right? It was intellectually a dead end, and already, at least in terms of philosophical theory, the fundamental premises of postmodernism, you started to see recycling and retreading already happening inside the academic world, which is a sign that a movement has reached its It's terminus and it's not going anywhere. So I thought the natural thing was then to say, okay, and a lot of people would say, okay, postmodernism has it at its moment, so to speak, and now we'll be off and doing other things. But that was to underestimate postmodernism not so much as an intellectual force anymore, but as a cultural force, that it was taken up by people who had kind of found postmodern ideas psychologically useful or culturally useful for their activist battles. And so it was carried over. And I don't think postmodernism in the 25 years since I wrote the book has changed at all intellectually, but nonetheless, it has spawned several cultural movements. And so the surprising thing then for me was people who are intelligent observers of the culture. They're not necessarily well read in the philosophy, but they are following very carefully what's going on in the art world or what's going on in journalism or how we are conducting our political elections and what's going on when we're raising children and having them navigate finding their identity, including their sexual and romantic identities. To see the postmodern themes carried over into those cultural sectors, and then again, thoughtful people who are studying those saying something strange is afoot here, and I don't know where this is coming from and why it has such a big head of steam so suddenly. So they start looking for where it is coming from. And so they come back to the theories of postmodernism. And so some of them find my book and they find it helpful to see why, say, in gender studies or why in journalism schools, there's an abandonment of an idea of human nature and natural human developments, or an abandonment of the idea of objectivity with respect to journalism and just kind of naked partisanship and willingness to make up facts if or so-called facts if so on. Right. So in that sense, it has become a kind of an ongoing part of my work to in effect be consulted on from a philosophical perspective what's going on in all of these other cultural sectors. Now, I mentioned the history, though, that in one sense, there's the cliche about history repeating itself or at least rhyming across the centuries. So one of the things I think that has been useful to me in my understanding and then in my writings is the historical perspective on these ideas. So to the extent to which the debates that we are having right now that seem very fresh and different, and to the young generation encountering these issues for the first time, they are fresh and different, but it is in many cases isomorphic or exactly the same general positions being articulated from 100 years ago. So if you have read, for example, the intellectual culture and the culture kampf or the culture wars going on in Germany in the 1920s, of course, the big thing is the rise of Hitler and the National Socialists, but that's
on the philosophical, artistic side.
That's right. There was the philosophy, there was the culture, there was the battles over religion, there were all of the concerns about young people these days, and so forth. So, in a sense, then what you're just hearing is echoes of all of those same positions on all of the same issues, just with a 2020s flavor. And then, of course, going back to the Roman emperor, so one of our empire rather. So one of our common questions is about whether our culture is in decline or not. And we're trying to figure out, it's a huge, massive culture, a big, giant economy. It's very dynamic and innovative in various ways. But at the same time, we have large numbers of people, it doesn't matter what your standards are, that are decadent and kind of outright nihilistic. And we don't necessarily have good data about whether it's 1% or 5 or 8% of the population. And we have arguments about what counts as decadence, but whatever. The question is that on some significant cultural dimensions, we have very serious problems. And we want to know, are those problems that we're going to be able to solve and get back on track, or are they, so to speak, signs of the beginning of the end?
And
Go
is
ahead.
is the idea that there are parallelisms and isomorphisms between the kinds of decadence that we're experiencing today and the
Yes.
kinds of decadence that the Roman Empire experienced, to
Right.
suggest perhaps if they are parallel that we might be going into a decline like they did. Is that the
Right. Yeah.
idea?
That's exactly the question comes up, and it's a common and it's a good question among thinking people who have some history, because the whole idea of history is it's a huge laboratory of all of these human experiments that have been done, and what can we learn from those experiments? And so, one of the ones that some of the ones we want to learn from are the more spectacular failures in history. So we say, the Greeks did some magnificent things, but they failed after just a few centuries. The Romans, again, did some magnificent things, but they again failed after just a few centuries. And here we are, we say America has done some great things, but it's now a few centuries. Are we following the same path as some other civilizations that are in decline? So I think the philosophically informed historical perspective, it's been useful for me. Obviously there are disanalogies and so on, but I do like to think that it's been enriching for me. But I think when you're mentioning the various interviews that I've done, people are looking for people who know both the philosophy and the history, who can hopefully help them shed some light on the things that are perplexing all of us as thinking human beings.
I can imagine it's been an interesting ride for you.
Hmm.
One of the projects that you've engaged in recently is Peterson Academy
Yeah.
launched, and you have two courses inside of Peterson Academy on modern philosophy and then postmodern philosophy. Each one of them 8 lessons. Excellent, job, by the way. It's, and very much in your style. One of the things that you did in those lessons is you presented the ideas of the particular thinkers across time. You found representative examples of modern and postmodern. You chose to examine their texts, to speak in their language, so we could get a sense for their worldview, and to explicate that without necessarily criticizing it.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
So you actually went through and you built up. Here's what this person said, and that kind of led here, and this, and you went through this entire story. It wasn't until the very end that you said, "Okay, well now I have an opinion about this, or
Exactly.
I have some conclusions to perhaps draw from this."
Yes. 16 lectures in, I'll have something to say. Yes.
Yes, and one of as I lovingly call myself a randroid, because someone once called me a randroid, and I think, okay, I will take on that. I attempt to integrate everything that I do into her philosophy, because I believe her philosophy is fundamentally right and powerful. And so, one of the ways that I've heard you describe the shift or the difference between modern and postmodern, we'll leave pre-modern alone for now, is that if we look at the big five or the big four, metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, politics, and aesthetics,
Okay.
right? Sometimes you talk about human being, and I wonder if that kind of maps over to aesthetics or not. But if we look at these five, the moderns say that in terms of metaphysics, there's an objective reality that is knowable.
Yeah. And it's the natural world. Yeah.
Yeah,
The
the
physical
natural world.
material world.
It's
Yes.
knowable, whereas the postmoderns say there is no there.
Yeah.
It's some type of flux that comes into existence through our creation.
Okay. Yeah.
Right.
Many versions of postmodernism will say that, or that they will say that it's just an unanswerable or even a nonsense question to try to say what is the there that's out there. And even to use a word like flux is already assigning some identity to it. So we're just going to back away from talking about reality at all. So I'm trying to put it in quotation marks,
Right,
or scare quotes. Yeah.
And
Okay.
then epistemologically, the moderns said that we can learn, we can use essentially science, rationality to examine data, create concepts, integrate our concepts, test them, and get an increasingly approximate expression, increasingly precise understanding of knowledge about reality.
Sure.
Whereas the postmoderns say that there is no canonical methodology. There is no way to essentially get better. There's only different perspectives,
Right.
and then the power relations that cause one perspective to be dominant at a particular time.
Right. So, again, it'll adopt a skeptical point about all of the knowledge claims. So you start saying there's not really knowledge, there's only like knowledge, right? When there's no truth, right? There are no facts because we can't cash these out in any successful way. So we back. And then, yes, we might then say, oh, we have our perspectives, but we can't say that any perspective is better than any other perspective because we don't have access to an independent reality to check the two different perspectives against. That would just be another perspective. So we're in a hall of mirrors socially, so to speak. And then if we are trying to say things like, no, mine is truer than yours, all I'm really doing is just making a social power play with respect to you, right? Mm-hmm. Or I'm just trying to express how I feel about mine, as it's some sort of subjective criterion.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah, and then the question becomes, okay, well, so if there is no knowledge, how could you have knowledge about morality or ethics
Sure.
or politics?
Yeah.
And one of the things that you point out, Jordan Peterson calls it postmodern neo-Marxism, and says these two terms should not go together, right? Postmodernism should not align with neo-Marxism because neo-Marxism takes an ethical and a political stance that postmodernism should undermine, but it doesn't. And one of the things you suggest and point out in your book is that it's seemingly surprising that of the major postmodernists, all of them were essentially on the Marxist train to various degrees. They had their quibbles with different regimes or different applications. So the modernist says, well, since we can know reality and we can look at human being, or you could say this is the Ayn Rand objectivist version of modernism, since we can understand human being, that which is good for the life of human being, that which causes the human being to live and thrive, is good, and that which causes the human being to shrivel and die is bad.
Right.
Whereas with the postmodernists, their ethical position is essentially anywhere they need it to be in order to further their political agenda. And I'm curious what you think about that formulation.
The second part of that was fine. The first part was the question of trying to square the circle, so to speak, or what seems to be a paradox. So if you take Marxism as a straightforward kind of modernist project, I don't know that this is the best interpretation, but if you say that what Marxism is that metaphysically there's a material world, that the material world goes by certain causal processes, it necessarily because of the laws of human economic production and the social structures that we develop, it has to go through tribal, feudal, capitalists, and so on stages. So there are cause and effects to history. That when we say that workers and manual laborers are the ones who are really adding value, and that capitalists are parasitic on that value, we are making both a factual claim about productivity, but also an objective normative judgment. These people are doing good work. These people are being parasitical. So if you take that as, say, the heart and soul of the Marxist project, they are trying to do social science, so to speak, right? And they're making certain kinds.
And in the opposition we're putting up, it's certainly on the modernist side.
That's right. So that would be to take Marxism and push it into the modernist camp, right? And then part of that then would be as a social science we can make predictions about how these laws of economic development are going to work out. So we know that capitalism has these internal contradictions and it will manifest in revolution, and the next stage will come about. So all of those are metaphysical claims about naturalism, and they are a very robust then set of scientific claims and knowledge claims. and then also underscoring some value claims. So the first puzzle then is to say, when you look at postmodernism as a philosophical system, it's denying all three of those things. It's, we can't say whether the reality is spiritual or ideal or material or physical. Those are all just nonsensical metaphysical questions, and we shouldn't be doing that. There are no such things as true stories about the world as a whole and cause and effect. All we have are narrow perspectives, and we tell stories. We use narratives, right? So we don't use the truth language or the science language anymore. And we never claim that we are stating facts. Instead, we have these subjective narratives. And then, as you suggested, when it comes to the value claims, I might have my value preferences and you have yours, but I'm not going to say that mine are more or less objective. So in that sense, Marxism and postmodernism seem to be opposed to each other. And it is true that many of in our generation, people who are classical Marxists, think of themselves as hardcore Marxists, they hate postmoderns, right? They see postmoderns as undermining the entire project. At the same time, though, and this was the middle part of what you were saying, which is quite right, though, that when you look at the leading postmoderns, they are all on the left, and pretty much all of them are on the far left. Prior, I want to say, to the year 1995 or 2000, you don't find any real classical liberal Marxists. You don't find any classical liberal postmoderns or monarchist postmoderns or religious Christian conservative postmoderns. Right? Instead, they're all following Michel Foucault, who joined the French Communist Party for a while. So he was doctrinaire Marxist and this is in his 20s, so he's not just a teenage kid who doesn't know what he's talking about. Jean-Francois Lyotard was a kind of Trotskyite Marxist, and so forth. So you run through the list. Richard Rorty, the American postmodernist. Sometimes you like to call himself a neo-pragmatist, and there's good reasons for that. But he talks about being raised in a sense by Trotskyite parents, who thought that if only Trotsky had prevailed over Stalin, the entire project would have been saved. So he was, as he put it, a red diaper baby, that's to say, raised by and a believer in the true faith. And he softened to some extent, but he still stayed at the very far left end of the political spectrum as well. So there is then a question how these guys who are all Marxist or Marxist friendly in their ethics and politics are putting that together with, as philosophers, and all of them were PhDs in philosophy, doing epistemology and cognitive studies and so forth. So how they're putting that package together, and that's precisely the question that you are raising. So I think the short answer just is to say that while postmoderns will abandon all of the Marxist / modernist on this interpretation, metaphysics and epistemology, and they will back away from saying there's such a thing as real human nature that is responsive to environmental conditions. All of those things we can't say are true or factual. We don't believe in any of that. Nonetheless, they all retain the Marxist value orientation, the idea that for them, the world is divided into strong versus weak, and therefore oppressors into oppressed, and that from their perspective, they have a felt connection to the oppressed, whoever the oppressed are. But value judgments, they think, are just part of a power play, so what they need to do is find a way to do whatever kind of activism, cultural, political, rhetorical, academic, educational, psychological activism. What tools can we use on behalf of the oppressed to help them in this grand political battle? And it's not that we think our side is right or true. It's just that's our subjective commitment, and we're just going to do anything we can, including using philosophies and ideologies and any sort of rhetorical tools available to us to help our subjectively committed to cause prevail in this free-for-all value battle.
Yeah. So if the modern is there is a reality, metaphysics versus we can't speak about reality. It's not even a flux. It doesn't make sense to try to do a metaphysical examination. And
Right.
if it,
So then what would that be to say? Because if I'm seeing the world and it doesn't seem like it's a flux, it's got things, and those things are predictable, and I follow certain routines, and there's cause and effect. But if I then say philosophically, and there are some Kantian roots at work here, that really this is just a subjective imposition or subjective structuring by my mind, or I've just been conditioned to parse out reality in certain ways and have certain expectations about it. If all of that is on the subjective side, then you say, well, what's this kind of initial raw material that's coming in that is being structured? And the postmodern point is to say that's an unanswerable question, right? So even if you say it's a flux, that would still be to say that there's something there.
that's still a type of meta-narrative that we should be
right.
suspicious of, or
Right, but you're
the
also,
kernel on which you could build a meta-narrative.
yes, and there are, you can't find that basic turtle because you'd have to, in some sense, be stepping outside of your subjective mental framework, seeing reality as it really is, and you're saying, oh, it really is a flux, right? But you can't get outside of your own head or
Yeah,
outside of your own.
again, the Kantian move, you can never get to the noumena, only the
That's
phenomena.
right. So the postmoderns want to say that there's a little inconsistency in Kant there, that we just, even to the extent of, in the very reserved, nuanced ways that Kant still wants to talk about the noumenal, that's still too much. And we just have to just not talk about it at all.
And so, like, there is no reality, and then reason is, for lack of a better term,
Let me
impotent.
jump on you a little bit there. Even from the postmodern perspective, you can't say that. You can't say that there is no reality, because that still would be to say that you've gotten outside of your head and there was nothing there. But you can't do that, right?
Fair enough.
So we even have to stop talking about like reality, right? In that sense.
Yes. It reminds me of Spinal Tap. That's enough of that. So, and then reason is impotent, or reason is not powerful. There is no canonical epistemological method we could use to come up with truth. So we just end up with different narratives, kind of a Nietzsche's perspectivalism taken to an extreme, let's say.
Yep.
And so it seems to me that the critical theory, critical race theory, critical feminist theory, etc., that these critical theories are fundamentally cynical because they use postmodernism as a way to deconstruct their opponents' arguments against them. But they don't expect consistency for themselves. They don't, like, if they're challenged on their epistemological basis, they just say, that's not what matters. What matters is experience. What matters is our commitment to this political end. And so the politics determines the ethics, determines the epistemology, determines, and that entire thing is shifting, and it's anything we need it to be at any time as long as we win. It seems to me that that's the rhetorical basis, the philosophical basis for the critical theories et al. Project.
Yeah, I think that's a fair characterization. Yeah, so the chain of derivation is that you start with your politics, and everything is in the service of one's politics. If you ask the philosophical question, well, where did your politics come from? Right, they will then say, if they're philosophically sophisticated, well, that it has to just be a subjective leap that I have made, right? Or it was something that was conditioned into me, and that would enable them to remain consistently postmodern. Now, just want to say just one thing about the terminology, because you introduced the term critical theory, And then downstream from that, critical race theory. I can't remember if you mentioned critical feminist theory and so on. And I want to say that I think you're right to say that the critical theorists will use postmodernism tactically, right? But they're not postmodern. So I think they are better characterized as siblings in the battle. So that if you look at the critical theorists, and here to say the important names are not Foucault and Derrida and Lyotard and Rorty. The important names here are Horkheimer, Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, and so forth. And again, what you have is sorry,
the Frankfurt School.
Yes, that's right. Because for where they started in Frankfurt, Germany. So again, they started as young men committed to Marxism. And in most cases, a pretty classical Marxism, but because they were smart guys and they had read, this was now 70 years after the publication of Marx's mature views, so they were aware historically that the Marxist predictions were not playing out the way Marx had said, and so they were still committed enough to the idea of doing social science to say that Marxism, while we are committed to it, nonetheless has some problems as social science. But what they are not going to do is, as members of critical theory, abandon the whole idea of there being such a thing as social science. Their reaction is to say what we need is a better social science. So that then is to say that Marx was on the right track, but he's incomplete in various ways. And so we need to adjust the theory. And this is a good social science move, right? Your theory is not working out. You don't necessarily throw it out. You try tweaking some of the variables, tweaking some of the assumptions, and so on. So what they are explicitly trying to do is in the 1920s, 1930s, and so forth, is see if they can take the core of Marxism. This is just somewhat arbitrary. Suppose you say Marxism says 10 important things. So we're going to keep 8 of them, but we're going to abandon 2 of them and substitute these other 2 over here. So what you will find them doing is saying, what we need to do is take Marx and add a better individual psychology at work there, because Marx tended to subsume everything to the collective and make the individual not very important. But maybe there's a smidgen of individuality that matters. And so if we add, say, Sigmund Freud, who is then, by the time we get into the 19-teens, 1920s, the big name in psychology, if we can find a hybrid of Marxism with Freudianism, then we will have a better social science that is going to be more predictive. So it's not only just going to be as kind of social oppression. We also have to talk, as the Freudians talk, about all of the individual repression that we do to ourselves. And it's not necessarily totally a function of social conditions. Right? So the individual often is repressing himself. So it's going to be, say, a Marx-Freud hybrid. That's going to be the right direction. Others in the Frankfurt School, this is what like Herbert Marcuse will want to say, well, maybe not Freud, maybe someone like Martin Heidegger. Right? So Heidegger is coming out of a different tradition. He's not a Marxist. Heidegger, as we know, ends up joining the National Socialist Party. He's a kind of a hardcore Nazi, but nonetheless, the idea here is if we can then bring in Heideggerian insights with Marxism and do a hybrid, then we'll have a better social science. Now, long story short here is that while they are still largely committed to Marxism, they're still trying to do social science, social psychology, to have a new and improved version of Marxism, and they're willing to abandon some elements of classical Marxism. So in that sense, they are not as radical as the postmoderns. Right? But I think that you are right to say that when it suits their then political purposes or their activist purposes, they will say, we have now our new version. I think it's the synthesis of Hegel and Marx and Heidegger, and that's the right version of critical theory. And they're having some debates within themselves about what the right synthesis is. They want to advance that as a positive agenda. Right? And so they will say, we are doing social science, so we're going to gather the data, we're going to make the arguments and so forth. But at the same time, we have all of these other ideological enemies. And one thing we can, of course, do is engage with our ideological enemies and debate their philosophy and debate their psychological theories and so forth. That's a lot of work, though. And we don't want to do that. If we want to find some way to dismiss all of our ideological enemies very quickly, postmodernism is very useful here. Exactly what you were just saying. If we can just find some way to say, well, everything that comes out of the liberal tradition, that's just, sublimated Freudian aggression. So we use an ad hominem argument. And so we just eliminate the entire economic body of work, the entire political philosophy body of work by means of one rhetorical argument that comes down to being an ad hominem. But that saves you a lot of work, puts your enemies on the defensive and so forth. So,
Yeah.
so I think they are using rhetorically postmodern arguments, but in their heart of hearts, they're still trying to do social science.
So one of the, I consider it to be a fundamental Marxist rhetorical trick is to say you are either part of the new man, the communist way of thinking, or you're bourgeois. And
Yes.
if you're bourgeois, then you're conditioned to be bourgeois.
Yes.
And so all of your thinking is fundamentally wrong. And therefore, as soon as we can label you as bourgeois,
Right.
we can write you off. And
Right.
the postmodernists and the critical theorists took that, you could
Yes.
say that, and added it to used postmodernism kind of as a justification for it.
Yes.
And so now they just say, if you're not with us, you're against us. If you're not
Right.
part of the problem, if you're not part of the solution, you're
Right.
part of the problem. And we don't need to address your arguments. I love this. Like, we
Yeah,
don't,
no,
we
exactly right.
can just write you off
Right.
as privileged, as whatever.
Sure, yeah, you're from the wrong economic grouping, or from the wrong gender grouping, or from the wrong ethnic grouping, or for the wrong whatever grouping that doesn't fit the agenda. Right? If the underlying common premise is that you did not acquire your beliefs by looking at the evidence, looking at the facts, and reasoning independently to your conclusions, if you reject that entire epistemology and substitute it that what we call reason is something that is conditioned into you by your environmental background or your social environmental background, then you have no justification for believing what you do is or believe is true. All you can say is, I happen to have been born into certain social circumstances and was conditioned a certain way. So then the critic of your position can then point out, well, you just believe that because you happen to have been born into certain social circumstances and were conditioned a certain way. Therefore, we don't have to try to reason with you or counter argument with you. You are just to be set aside, and that can be a disingenuous power play rhetorically, but it can be very effective. Now, why I say it can be just a rhetorical power play is that if you are a sophisticated thinker, you have to realize very quickly that the same argument applies to your own views, because if everybody is in their views determined by their social circumstances, then whatever, you're the Frankfurt School critic or you're the postmodern.
Your critical legal theory.
Yes, that's right. Whatever it is, you then will have to say, to be consistent, that you believe your critical theory because you happen to have been born into certain social circumstances and conditioned into believing it. So you can't say that your belief in critical theory is true or better than any other one. So then we're just into people have different belief systems and no way to reconcile them.
And you say, if you're a sophisticated thinker,
Yes.
then you immediately take that on.
Yes.
And if you're in that sense, if you're sophisticated and you're intellectually honest,
Yes.
then you could say, add that to the conversation. You understand that it's just one
Right.
perspective versus another, but in fact they do not do that. They do the exact opposite. And
Right, which is to indicate that it is a rhetorical power play that they are engaged in. Now, they can't get away with it in the sophisticated circles because people who are not advocates of that kind of environmental determinism or that kind of cultural relativism that ends up being skeptical, they will point out that contradiction to them. So then you have to develop some sort of rhetorical response to diffuse the criticism or shunt the criticism onto the side so you can continue to do what you do. Now, just one more footnote, though, is that all of this environmental determinism and therefore cognitive conditioning and value conditioning that comes out in the kind of relativism that we're talking about is also explicit in Karl Marx in his original philosophy. So one of the reasons why I was hedging a bit and saying that we could see Marx as a part of the modern project, that we are looking at the evidence and we're trying to do science the way scientists do and do good social science, is that Marx recognizes himself that his project can't be that, because all of the different people who are saying that they are looking at the world, they're only looking at the world according to their class membership. They're only analyzing the data rationally according to their conditioning, and their value framework is a result of their conditioning. So he knows that he can't say that the proletariat, for example, their class logic is truer than bourgeoisie and their class logic. They're just two different logics. So he is explicitly what we call a polylogist. Right? So there's not one logic, there are multiple logics. And he is a polytruthist and a polyjustificationist and a polyscienceist. Right? So Marx himself did recognize that he was, so to speak, in this bind. And I think in his more honest points, you don't see this so much in the published writings, but when you read some of the letters, he is, in corresponding with Friedrich Engels at various points, saying, all of this talk about dialectic and so forth, I'm just using it as hocus pocus against our class enemies. It's to further the cause. He didn't use that exact language, but you know what he's saying.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we can talk about the big four: metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, politics. And then there's, you could say, the fifth, aesthetics. And when I think about the Ayn Rand hero, and it's called Becoming an Ayn Rand Hero, when I study Ayn Rand heroes, the characters in the literature, and I say, how can I use their model to inspire me to make my life into a heroic adventure in the style of an Ayn Rand hero? I think, okay, I can look at metaphysics, I can look at this domain and say, I'm going to study it and say there is an objective reality. There is a reality which is knowable. Mm-hmm. And if I take that on, that's the basis. And then I can say, and then I have an epistemology which says that reason allows me to know reality and to build conceptual, to clearly define my concepts such that they're linked to reality, so they're not floating abstractions and stolen concepts.
Yeah.
And then I can build an ethics which is based on my knowledge of human being and life. Mm-hmm. And so I build an ethics which says that my life is the good, including my relationships with all the people that I love and care about and the environment in which I live, in the short term and in the long term, across the entire spectrum of my life. What is the good? The good is that which is good for me.
Yep.
And therefore, since in politics, I should treat everyone else as if they are reasonable creatures dealing with reality who have the right to pursue their own values. And that leads to laissez-faire capitalism. And then the fifth, aesthetics, Ayn Rand says romantic realism. That within the realm of realism, you seek for the highest expression of goodness and values. And when I think about the Ayn Rand hero, the mechanics is really making sure that your epistemology and metaphysics are focused on reality and reason. Mm-hmm. If you do that, that will lead to an ethics of self-interest in context, which will lead to a capitalist or a free market perspective, individual rights. And so that's kind of the mechanics, but the driving force is the beauty. Like Ayn Rand says that she wrote Atlas Shrugged so that she could create the ideal man that she wanted to see. She created a vision of the highest possible, and then that serves as the context. It seems to me that in the woke, critical legal theory, critical feminist theory, critical race theory, the cynicism behind that is designed to promote a politics because they have an aesthetics. They have a view of reality that somehow they can have power because they're not looking for equality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When you think about the aesthetic perspective or vision that makes the leftist politics alive and vibrant, how do you understand the relationship between the aesthetics and politics?
Yeah. No, that's a good question. That's a hard question. And it was a very nice summary, by the way, of the various steps in integrating it all. But there is always the question about one's conception of the highest possible to you, and that might be a very romantic conception of what's possible, or it might be a very chastened, low-level conception of what is possible to you. And all of that is informed by the experiences you have, the thinking that you do, and it over time conditions your emotional style and your emotional reactions to things, your felt sense about who you are and what life should be about as well.
My sense of life, so to speak.
Well, yes, yeah, that's the good technical term to use there. So then, all of that though is starting from day one, and we can say kids are philosophical as they are growing up. It's a long developmental process, and it's usually not until one is into one's teens that one is starting to do more self-consciously and systematically the kind of philosophy that you're talking about. What is metaphysics? What is epistemology? What is my view of human nature? And working out explicitly my arguments and my positions on that and making sure that they all fit together. You're doing elements of that in varying degrees when you are 4, 6, 9, 11 years old and so forth. But what that then is to say is that by the time one is a young adult, and if one is of a philosophical disposition already, one nonetheless has an individual psychology that's already extraordinarily rich and complicated. So there's a very interesting question about, as we mature fully into adult psychology, what is driving that development, whether it's more, I have a psychology that's more or less in place, say by the time I'm 15, 16 years old, and I will then gravitate toward explicit philosophies that affirm my...
Resonate with that, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And so that then is to say is that philosophy is serving for that kind of individual a more after-the-fact affirmation of the psychology that's already in place. Or whether to the it's possible, if one is active-minded and is engaging in objective processes and so forth, that as one thinks through various things, there will be cognitive dissonance in some places with, and emotional dissonance rather, with my psychology as it has developed up to my age 15 or 16 or so. But I'm going to persist with my now explicit, conscious, rational judgment about what the truth is or what the proper value is, and that will then change over time my psychology. So that then is to say I will make myself explicitly into the image of my philosophy. And I think it's probably true that most people are a mix of both of those styles, and it's a long-term project. Now then, the role of aesthetics in all of that. Again, that aspect of it is deep. A large part of what we are looking for in art is an affirmation of the our psychology, and sometimes it's the emotional side of our psychology. Sometimes it's more intellectual side of our psychology, and both of those are embedded in our bodies. So sometimes we want a combined emotion, kind of reason, embodiment experience as well. So we will seek aesthetic experiences so that we can experience that, the thing that we are looking for. So just to concretize that a little bit. So if, for example, I want to experience certain things, often I will say I'm going to listen to music. And when I listen to music, though, I'm looking for a certain kind of music. And I will select songs in many cases because I know what kind of emotional experience I am going to have when I am listening to that music. And in many cases, you will just lie on your sofa or in a comfortable chair, and you're not doing much physically, and your mind, you're not thinking logically, you're just letting the music take you to a certain emotional place. But you might then say, when I'm going for art, I want a different kind of experience, and I like using my brain and figuring things out. And so what I want to do is I want to watch a TV show, or I want to watch a movie, and I don't want a comedy, and I don't want a horror show. I want a detective show. And when I select a detective show, I know I'm going to have a certain kind of aesthetic experience, but there's going to be a puzzle, right? Someone, say, gets murdered, and nobody's going to know how it happened. And a big part of the project is the detective gathers a certain amount of evidence, and that then logically points his or her reasoning in a certain direction. And you follow that, and you like that experience, and you consider other possibilities, and then you rule out these possibilities. But then a new piece of evidence comes along, and you have to rethink everything, and someone who was ruled out now is back in, and so forth. So there are emotions that go along with this, but primarily you're looking for an intellectual aesthetic experience, right? Or another, just one more example. If I go, for example, to a dancing show, and in many cases these things are very artificial, but there's the music and you see people moving, but our natural response when we hear certain kinds of music and we see other people moving is we have a certain cognitive experience, a certain emotional experience, but that embodiment is what we are responding to. And so, if we are forced to sit in our chair, you watch people at dance recitals, right? They sit up a little straighter, or they start moving, right? Or they start tapping their feet. And so I think that's a somewhat artificial way to experience dance, but the natural thing in response to dance is yourself to want to start participating in the dance. And so that's a kind of aesthetic experience that is involving the embodiment. So the point of all of this then is to say that the art experience is engaging with us some or all of our important human being characterizations in a stylized way such that we can experience them. And that's only half of an answer to what you were saying, because the other part of it is then to say it's not only that we want to experience certain states, we want to be motivated by those experiential states then to go and live our lives in a way that we think is an appropriate way. So, and here again, I think there's a big divide in the water. You talk about the woke type versus the more romantic type, if we just use those as shorthand tags. In most cases, right, people who are wokists, they are looking for movies, or they're looking for various kinds of artistic experiences that will affirm to them, that sense of I'm living in a world of great injustice and people being oppressed. That's what they are responding to. And they don't want movies that show people overcoming their adversities and succeeding in the end. That feels alien to them. They don't want to experience that. They want movies that affirm them, and then that inspires them to go in their along their way. And then, as you are suggesting, for people for whom I have a worked out philosophy that I think the world is knowable and accessible, and that I'm competent to figure it out and achieve my values, and I have healthy values, then I will not want to watch movies where everybody hates each other and is passive aggressive and three people commit suicide at the end. That's not going to be something I respond to. I'm going to want something that is a romantic movie, precisely because I want that experiential state for 2 hours, but also I want it to still be with me tomorrow morning when I get up and go off and do my things.
Yeah. I've made it a practice to reread Atlas Shrugged once a year for essentially the last 30 years.
Wow. Well, you're ahead of me.
So part of it is, I look out in the entertainment landscape, in the literature landscape, and I think, what are stories that are actually great? And you can go back to the Iliad and the Odyssey, and now you've got heroes and things, but perhaps slave morality has taken over for such a long time. Atlas Shrugged provides for me an aesthetic vision that the more I interact with it, the more it resonates with that part of me that says, I can create a beautiful life. I can live a heroic life. I can take responsibility to use reason, to work with reality, in respect with other people, to realize my values. I'm curious how Atlas Shrugged has, if it has served, and Fountainhead and Ayn Rand's work in general, how it has served you in that capacity, or has it?
Well, no, that's an interesting question, because I read those books as for my personal reading, but I've also in my professional work, since I've been a professor of philosophy, I have regularly used Fountainhead in my Introduction to Philosophy course. And then I've used Atlas Shrugged sometimes in my, the course was called 20th Century Philosophy course. And then sometimes I've used excerpts from it, the stuff on leadership in Chapter 1, contrasting Dagny and James Taggart. It's almost like a case study in contrasting leadership and unleadership styles. And then all of the, what I think of as public choice themes about how the political process is manipulated by certain kinds of people who are supposed to be capitalists, like James Taggart and Orrin Boyle, in contrast to kind of market entrepreneur capitalists like Dagny and Hank Rearden and so on. So I've used that book a lot in my my business and economic ethics course over the years. But let me say, though, those two experiences are somewhat different for me. When I'm just reading them for myself for pleasure, it's one thing. When I am Mr. Professor Man and using them, then it's the experience is
less embodied.
That's true. And in one case, the emotion is more to the fore, and of course, it's working very closely with the rational analysis that's going on. But the emphasis is different, whether I'm reading it for personal or for pleasure. But also, even on the personal side, when I read the two books, for me, reading Fountainhead is more of an aesthetic experience, and it is more inspirational in the sense that you are talking about. So I find that I read it in that mode, and it works on me. And I've reread it several times, and it always has the same effect. That's not to say that I don't notice intellectually new things each time. And I find myself thinking about this, that, and the other thing, and I should mention this or use this in class the next time or whatever. But that's very much not what the emphasis is in the experience. But it's different for me when I read Atlas Shrugged, because there I find almost always, even if I start reading it for pleasure, it's a long winter break, so I'm going to read a big fat novel over the Christmas break or whatever. But I find whenever I'm reading Atlas, my philosopher brain kicks in a lot more, right? And
it's so rich and challenging and provocative.
Well, it is, and so that's not to say that it's not also an aesthetic experience, but the weighting is much different. And so I will start finding myself thinking about the mind-body problem and Descartes, and is she making an allusion to Heidegger here when she's talking about Professor Simon Pritchett? And then So I'm analyzing the text in a much more literary critic or philosophical literary critic way, and trying to think about the characters as representative of different philosophical traditions and so on. So now that could be just idiosyncratic in the sense of my psychology. I'm both a personal reader of aesthetics and a professor of philosophy, but I do think it also does say something about the texts themselves, that both of them are philosophical literature, and this would be another discussion we would have to have. But I think in in Fountainhead, the literature is weighted more heavily than the philosophy, maybe 55-45, whereas I think in Atlas, the philosophy is weighted more heavily than the literature, maybe 60-40 or something like that. So,
Yeah. Especially when you include Galt's speech.
yeah, well, that's right. Yeah, so aesthetics is always both show and tell, but in Rand, the proportions of showing and telling are different in different works.
Well, so thank you, Stephen. Absolute pleasure. I look
It
forward to
really
having more
was, yeah.
conversations.
Yes.
And congratulations with Peterson Academy. May your star continue to shine bright,
Well,
and
thank
your
you for that.
insight continue to influence people in the culture, so that we live a more heroic, modernistic, built in reality, using reason, taking responsibility, respect, realization. So
Okay,
thank you.
nicely said. All right, we'll talk another time.
Okay. Bye bye.
All right.